Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. You can find this podcast at LGGpod, and we are on YouTube at youtube.com/at LGGpodcast. Okay.
We're still getting used to the
all
YouTube
these
ad.
We should probably stop calling it Twitter, too. It hasn't been called Twitter in like a year and a half.
I don't know.
I just keep forgetting. I still, like on my phone, I still search for Twitter, not X, because like, well, X could be anything, you know?
That's true.
Today's episode, we're going to revisit a topic that we very briefly hit in our very first season, which is cosplaying. In our first season, we did an episode on the IP issues involving you and your cosplay when you go to a convention. But in that episode, we were focused mainly on cosplaying, known characters and things from existing properties. We're going to do something a little different today.
Yeah, the idea what we want to focus on here is the idea, and you see this definitely if you go to conventions, the idea of you are creating a character. You're a character which doesn't exist. But you are clearly centering yourself within an existing universe. So you are a, random red shirt in the Star Trek universe. You are, an officer in the Empire in Star Wars. You are a random Jedi.
Like the guys in the 501st do that.
Yeah. Now, we're even going to stay a little bit away from them just because they're stormtroopers, which are kind of nameless, faceless appearances in the movies.
They all kind of look the same. We want to talk about a situation where you've made up a new character and a new costume that the costume itself doesn't really appear in the universe you're bringing it out of. And we're going to talk mostly about Star Wars and Star Trek and sort of the more iconic, recognizable costuming properties. But you're making something new. So a Jedi with his or her own clothing, own look, own lightsaber design. That's not, it's nowhere in Star Wars, the exact thing you've done, but it's clearly comes from Star Wars.
And a good example of this is that you're also not necessarily changing your look to look like anybody. So it may just be your natural face, your natural appearance. Yeah. You may have put on prosthetics, but your prosthetics are your own design. You may have, pointed ears as a, Jedi, to sort of, mix match universes here a little bit. You're not trying to do makeup. You're not trying to appear as anything in the universe which particularly exists. In some sense, you're going as yourself. You're just going as yourself as a persona in the universe. Now, yourself may include, hey, I'm going to go as, a Gungan or something like that. But, so you may be wearing
but you're not any particular
makeup,
Gungan.
But you're not any particular
You're not Jar Jar. Who would do that? But
I don't know. It could be fun to cosplay as Gungan.
That may actually be a really hard one to do with all the big rabbit ear things they've got to deal with.
The hard part would be not getting beaten up. But
yes. Not talking like that. Okay, so we're thinking through, and this idea came to us because we saw somebody on Reddit asking about an original lightsaber design, and we were like, the issues here kind of apply more broadly to any time you come up with something new and original that is from a universe but not directly copied from anything in particular in the universe. So another example would be you come up with your own spaceship design for a hypothetical ship that is clearly from Star Wars. It looks like a Star Wars ship. But how do you define what that means, right? Like if I give you a new starship design, I tell you it's either Star Trek or Star Wars, you'll probably guess which one it's from, or which one it's meant for pretty accurately because they look very different.
But at the same time, if I hand you the Millennium Falcon and an X-Wing, what do they have in common? Virtually nothing.
Nothing really, yeah.
And so you kind of bump into this idea. This goes back to our very first episode, if you haven't done it, where we talk about the idea of trade dress in the Rogue One trailer. And stuff having to do, which was, new at the time, which has to do with just what makes something look like Star Trek, what makes something look like Star Wars. These universes have distinct looks. Most people could say something belongs in the Star Trek universe versus it belonging in another universe. Examples of things you come to, most people would say Star Wars is grungier. Yes. It's more angular. It's a lot more industrial. Star Trek tends to be sort of the curved lines. Yeah. Clean look, stuff like that.
Star Wars has this lived-in, sort of abused and mistreated universe look. It's like you said, it's gritty. It's industrial is a good way to put it. Whereas Trek is this utopian future, right, where everything is clean lines. You're right, circular. Everything has a saucer section. It's a very, very different aesthetic. Even compare that to something like Aliens, which is
very dirty.
Yes,
dirty. It's actively dirty
and unnerving, right? Like all the alien sculptures or alien structures have this sort of biologic,
very
sort
organic,
of skeletal look to it. Yeah, that's the Geiger stuff.
Yeah, the Geiger stuff. But it's also because, again, if you take Alien is on board a trash barge, essentially, it's a salvage barge. Aliens is on a planet being terraformed. So, it's raining all the time because of the fact that it's being terraformed and you're in a building that's been partially destroyed.
Yep.
So, of course, it's, it would be like, being inside a building that's been sitting in a monsoon for, months before you got there. Of course, it's damaged and gross and moldy and everything else. But yeah, I think you get into these looks behind. Another great sort of example I think you bump into with one is Blade Runner. Most people would say
distinct.
a very distinct, sort of very clear thing. Now, one of it's the shafts of light, which, Ridley Scott was just known for. That was the thing that he did. But, the idea of it being kind of, in some sense, what I would call the Japanese 80s future.
Yes, this tall urban sprawl, advertising everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and so being sort of being aesthetics associated with Japan in the 80s in particular, you have a lot of things that hover and float around, that kind of being, a lot of the aspect behind it. You have the hovering noodle stand that comes up to him. And again, very Asian type themes. And again, I think particularly Japanese themes with, the thing on the street is not a hot dog vendor. It's a noodle stand. Mm-hmm. Much more what you'd expect to find if you were in Japan than if you were in New York City. Although that may be true
Chinatown,
anymore.
Yeah.
but there's those distinct looks that a lot of these things have that most people can say, hey, yes, this belongs in a distinct look. Now, those looks change over time. But they're also, they're clearly different between it. And the longer things run, one could argue, the more of this look they get.
We'll talk about that with Star Trek in particular. Star Wars has done, I think, with some exceptions, a better job. Not like it's a bad job, but a different vision, right? Star Wars has tried to look more consistent from series to series, whereas Star Trek has been more interested in evolving the look and trying different things. So we'll talk about that in a little bit.
A good example, I think, is actually taking the idea of the spaceships is what it is. A Star Destroyer looks like a World War II era battleship. The turrets are visible. They're moving around on the surface. There's a lot of bulbous things that stick out.
Yeah,
things
it's a
like
big,
that.
ponderous floating weapons platform, basically.
Yeah. Whereas, the Enterprise, which probably has just as much firepower, it's all hidden.
Yeah.
Because it's an exploration ship. It's not a warship. Even like a Klingon warbird is not made out to be a warship. It's clean lines. Yes, there's a giant turret on the front of it in the form of sort of a ball turret that's on the front of it, but it's not immediately recognizable as a turret.
Yeah.
So those kind of things I think you bump into.
Let's talk about the IP issues. We'll start with copyright. Copyright is in some sense maybe the trickiest one to deal with because you have two ways you can. So let's reset. With copyright, we always say this: copyright's about copying, and
it's about aesthetics
and about the way things look, right? So there's literal copying and there's non-literal copying. Literal copying is what it sounds like. I've literally just copied something exactly as it appears from a different protected work and used it in my work. That's infringement, unless fair use applies. And then there's non-literal copying where you've copied elements, but not the literal elements. So a good example of this, I think we talked once before about the Wind Done Gone, which was a rewriting of Gone with the Wind from the point of view of one of Scarlett O'Hara's slaves. So nothing was literally copied. It's not like Alice Randall cut and paste sections of Margaret Mead's book, but she did copy story elements, general narrative arcs, character designs. None of those things are literally protected by copyright, but there is protection for the selection and arrangement of the non-literal elements in the form of the plot.
That's not totally true. We get into the idea, we've mentioned it before on the program, character copyright, and the idea of characters having copyrights in themselves. So, you talk about something like Scarlett O'Hara being a character, there is some, at least, copyright in the character of Scarlett O'Hara.
Well, the Copyright Office would tell you no, right? I've tried to register characters before, and they've said, no, we don't recognize that. But when you get into court, although they, whether it's officially how they recognize it or not, that's how the law tends to get applied.
Yeah.
When we ask, did you copy the book or did you copy the character? Is your character the same character? And if that's the case, then you've arguably infringed the derivative work right.
Yeah, and it gets weird because you kind of get into what rights are these things, how do they tie into derivative work, and how far do they go? And I know we've mentioned on the show before. I wrote a paper on this years ago, having to do with copyright in universe, and that's what we're getting into in this kind of thing with it, which is we're now getting beyond anything where we can say a court has recognized a clear copyright here. We can even look at it and say there's a copyright in a costume. I think that's also something you can get into. But now we're saying the costume is not being copied. Pieces of it are being...
Yeah, maybe. Or ideas behind the costume are being copied. So we were talking before we started about, what makes... Let's say we wanted to go as a Jedi Knight to like a Star Wars celebration.
Yeah.
Okay, so what makes you look like a Jedi Knight? Well, the most obvious thing is the lightsaber.
Yep.
So let's talk about that. What would I take to a convention if I want to design my own? It would be a handle with a bunch of stuff stuck on it.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be a handle. It needs to sort of, be around the size of a sword hilt.
Yep.
Which is effectively what it is.
Probably got some kind of dish, like some kind of round convex thing on the end that the blade would, in theory, emerge from.
Although it doesn't have to, because, if you think about like Anakin's, or, it's sort of just got an, open hole.
Yep.
Sort of stuff like that. Or Kylo Ren, which has a crossbeam. So there's all sorts of different things as to, what it could be. It tends to have a lot of sort of bulbous knobs and things like that. It has, an activator stud, so to speak, a little slider,
some kind of switch or something. Yeah.
But again, none of this is necessarily required to make a lightsaber.
Yeah. So if I have all those, if I have different components that look different, my own original design, but I have the same kind of choices that I've made. There's some kind of emitter for the blade, and there's a on and off switch, and it's a handle. Does copyright cover the idea of a laser sword with an on switch and a handle? I mean, I'd say no, probably not.
Doesn't seem to. I mean, it could be a flashlight for all you know.
What's the difference? I mean,
or quite frankly, in the idea, and just using this as the example, if I was to go to the British Museum and I was to get a 14th century sword hilt, and I copied it exactly, but I take off the crossbeam, and so it's just it's a long sort of thing, and I take the blade off, and then I size it so that it's a little bit bigger to fit in my hand. It's a little rounder, sort of stuff like that. How can I possibly have infringed the copyright in something that thing was built in the 14th century?
Yeah,
and I've copied it exactly. There's no copyright in that. There can't be.
It seems like you're if you're trying to assert protection at that level of breadth, you're starting to bump up against the idea-expression dichotomy, which we always talk about. Copyright protects the particular way you've expressed something, not the idea behind it. And if you go too broad and assert, well, we've got all these 500 different lightsaber designs in Star Wars, and so if you make one that has the same kinds of elements, you've infringed that. Well, now it kind of sounds like you're using copyright to protect the idea of a laser sword.
Yep. A laser sword hilt in particular is what we're talking about. Because again, one of the things I think for most people, if you're going to do this as a cosplay, you don't have a lightsaber which has a blade. You typically just have the hilt because you're going to carry it. You're not going to be getting in lightsaber battles, sort of stuff like that. And so you've really just got the hilts of a sword. You can't just protect the hilt of a laser sword, the hilt of any kind of sort of fancy modern sword as being something which isn't which isn't an expression. It's all an idea. I mean, that's literally what I'm expressing. I'm expressing the idea of a hilt of a laser sword. That's an idea.
To your point, if that's going to be a problem, fine. I'll just go buy a flashlight from Target and hang it off my belt. I mean, doesn't that basically get me there?
Yeah, and that's a flashlight. It'd be a mag light. And so that's it. We're really getting into this type of thing. Now, this is where I think it gets really interesting in cosplaying, because if you're going to play an original Jedi, one of the aspects of the Star Wars universe, if you get into it, is each Jedi's lightsaber is unique. They even have an entire episode of Clone Wars about this, when they have a bunch of Jedi younglings that go out, they get their kyber crystals, multi-part episode, and then they have to build their lightsabers. And the whole point is the droid that comes out and brings them components as to what do they think their lightsaber should look at. So, for example, as the Wookiee makes his out of wood, it's a wooden handle. That's discussed in the thing of being appropriate, for what it is, being a unique choice. So one of the things you have from it is it's this idea that basically says it should be unique. It should go to your personality. So if I look at it and say, okay, I'm creating a completely unique Jedi character, which is me, which is my personality, what's mine's going to look like? Well, maybe mine's more industrial looking.
Yeah.
Maybe I want mine to be squarer. Or maybe I can readily get away from essentially anything that's component of his aesthetic. So again, one of the ones could be, mine's going to be a 14th century British broadsword. That's
you are very English.
Yeah, I am very English. 50%. And so, that kind of, why can't I, that's part of what fits the aesthetic. But that's also, in some sense, what makes it a lightsaber is the fact that it is customized for it. So we're really bumping into this idea that says, when does it become a lightsaber, and is a lightsaber protectable? Now, one thing we talked about, we said, the word lightsaber is arguably protectable.
That's different. It's
different.
Yeah.
But, if we want to just call it a generic light sword, we're going to say it's a lightsaber just because it's easier to talk about here.
Let's talk about this, too. Well, I mean, can I just call my thing a lightsaber? Which one,
2 words maybe spelled with SBBRE,
or even if I spell it the same way. I mean, the device in the show or in the universe is called a lightsaber. That's just the generic name for it. It's not a trademark within the universe of Star Wars. It's only a trademark to us.
Well, it's trademark when you sell stuff.
When you sell stuff, right? So if I just call mine, well, it's a lightsaber. Is that arguably a nominal fair use? I'm just identifying what the thing is called.
Yeah, you're identifying what the thing is
called. It's not a commercial use,
but it's not really called that. That exists inside a fictional universe.
Yeah.
And so, what is it really called? Well, it tilts a laser sword. I mean,
so what does the lightsaber trademark in our world cover? I mean, I would assume that it's being used when they sell the lightsaber props.
I have to assume that there's stuff for toys, and things like that, which a cosplay, item would be considered a toy, a costume aspect, things like that.
But if I'm not selling it, why can't I call it a lightsaber?
If I'm just making it myself, so I'm not actually necessarily competing. Now, you could bump into a trademark thing called dilution. Which is basically there's a trademark principle that says, even though you're not necessarily directly competing with me, you're hurting my mark because you're diluting it. You're making it associated with other things. So you got to look at this and say, that's what they'd be essentially asserting here is dilution, because while you're not selling, lightsaber brand laser swords or lightsaber brand laser sword hilts, you're diluting my right into having something which is associated as a lightsaber being my laser swords. And stuff like that. So
I want to say dilution, though, still requires some level of commercial. I haven't looked at it in a while, but last time I recall, maybe it's still possible with enough casual use, but typically it's when there's no likelihood of confusion. Everybody knows it's not the same thing, but nevertheless, unchecked use in a non-confusing manner still reduces the value or otherwise offends the original.
Yeah, let's just get into a little bit of the law there for a second. So typically, trademark infringement requires confusion as to source. That's the way it's usually used. So basically, the idea is if I'm referring to something, if I call my restaurant McDonald's, but I'm not associated with, the McDonald's we all know and love, I'm confusing as to source. You think I am that McDonald's, but I'm not. I'm confusing the average consumer. I will oftentimes refer to it, even though it really isn't legally accurate, that trademark is in some respects a consumer protection law.
Oh, it is. I think it absolutely is.
Yeah, but that's not the way it's portrayed in the law, because it's always corporations fighting each other over it.
Well, the idea is the consumers don't have the wherewithal, resources, or impetus to go enforce it all. So if you want people to jealously guard trademarks for the consumer's benefit, give them the right to do that and let the companies fight it out.
So the idea basically being is that normally you're saying, hey, it's confusing because you think my thing is your thing. So if you were to go out there and say, hey, here's my lightsaber handle that I'm selling, commercially, that would imply, hey, that Disney or LucasArts or somebody who specifically owns the trademark now, you're associating with them, and the assumption is they made it and they didn't. That's a sort of says to confusion. But in this, you really don't have any of that.
No, nobody's going to think that when you say this is my lightsaber, that they're going to think that comes from
cosplaying with it.
Yeah.
They assume, and I built it and stuff like that. So that's where you get into dilution. Dilution is kind of the recognition that, hey, you can still harm trademark rights even without there necessarily being confusion, because you're just putting too much other stuff out there. And I don't think it has to be commercial. But it's one of those things where it's you may have to have a lot of it. And so it kind
I think
of
the less commercial it is, the more you'd need. It would effectively become commercial. Like there's so much of it going on that it has the same effect on commerce as if you were selling it.
And that's where you bump into here is you can say, well, any one person doing this is probably fine, but what if everybody at the convention's doing this? Yeah. What if hundreds of conventions, everybods doing it?
If you're at Star Wars Celebration, presumably nobody cares, right? Like they know that that's what's going on. Let's talk also about the costuming. It's not just the lightsaber you would have. If you're going to, quote unquote, dress like a Jedi, you're going to wear basically desert garb. And why? Because Obi-Wan wore desert garb in Episode 4, and so now all Jedis everywhere wear desert garb, except for Luke in Episode 6.
I still think part of it is it's a monastic robe. I sort of,
I feel like that's a retcon on why they do that.
But to me, it's the idea of them being the Jedi Knight, the being the sort of, I think there's a lot with monastic society behind it. Yes, there is some argument that that's simply retcon because he wore the robe because of the fact that it was on a desert planet, but they liked the look.
Well, how about this? So I'm going to wear a lightsaber and my desert robe, and I'm going to go to the convention as a wizened old Jedi. My name is Old Ben.
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem?
Yeah, well, especially it's how you are, Ben, and you are old.
Like, I can't use my own name now?
So, yeah, that's what you know about me. Well, but yeah, it's,
if you go to Star Trek, can you go as Captain Kirk?
Can I go as Captain Kirk? Yes.
You're just a random captain. Not that Captain Kirk, just a Captain Kirk.
Yes, of the USS something or other. But yeah, those are the problems you bump into. Is it's now this thing.
Well, you're a patent lawyer. You're, of course, the captain of the USS Enterprise.
Well, the original Enterprise is a commercial name, and there's a whole section of one of the Star Trek novels about how Enterprise is a strange name for spacecraft since it's associated with economics.
Well, it's based on the U.S. there's the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier. It still exists.
Well, but that's the joke that they have in it is the whole thing behind it. I always think this is a fun anecdote story. The way the book portrays it, the USS Enterprise in the Star Trek universe is named because there's a long history of things being named the USS Enterprise, including a U.S. space shuttle, an aircraft carrier, and then they create a few other additional ones. The joke of it, of course, is the USS Enterprise space shuttle is named after the USS Enterprise in Star Trek. So they actually retconned by reversing the pattern of what actually happened, which I think is hilarious as to what it was, and also a really cute idea.
Yeah. It's funny, right? Because in the Star Trek universe, the Star Trek show can't have existed, of course.
Exactly. And so it allows you to then say, well, yeah, because it was named, the reason why the USS Enterprise space shuttle was named was because it was a good name, and therefore we were picking on the name of why we're naming the space shuttle, the spaceship in Starfleet that, as opposed to the space shuttle being named after the ship in Starfleet.
Okay, so going back to the robes.
Totally unrelated.
So if I just pick some generic robes, is that a problem? Just no. How about this?
How many kids play a Jedi by wearing a bathrobe?
Right? Like, I'm just a cheap ass, right? I'm going to go to the convention. I'm going to bring my Duralite flashlight with me on my regular work belt I'm wearing now. I'm going to grab my bathrobe, and I'm just a lazy poor Jedi.
And maybe I have like a camera case or something to carry stuff in on my belt too.
Exactly. So what could I possibly be infringing with my terrible terry cloth robe?
Yeah, and that's the thing we sort of look at and say, well, one, you aren't that accurate of a Jedi from what people would say is a show accurate type of thing, but you have all the aspects, don't you? And this is where we kind of get into that idea expression dichotomy. That's just the idea. You know, there's no question. That's just idea at that point in time. So you get into. Well, but now if I start saying, well, let me style the bathrobe a little bit. Let me not use a Timberland, type pack. Let me, put some extra doodads on my mag lights. So where do we cross into it being an expression? But do we? Because the expressions are specific to the various
I didn't
Jedi.
Copy anything really from the show. And going back to my point before, the more aggressively you enforce that, I think the harder that gets. Which is probably why this kind of thing isn't enforced very often. One, there's what are the damages? There's really nothing. So,
though you do have it, I think it's something you've started to see is there are a few more places now that are starting to crack down on cosplaying. And particularly where you're bumping into it is if you show up and you're cosplaying at the convention, I'm fine with that. But now if you're posting up plans to 3D print a helmet
and sell it
and selling them,
or how about this? The people who dress up as Disney characters and go to children's birthday parties for money.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure most of them are not licensed.
Yeah, I'm sure they're not licensed. And again, a lot of them probably don't really look like the Disney characters are just enough. But you got aspects. I mean, if you have a redhead show up with a mermaid tail, we all know who it is.
Well, we talked about this a couple years ago. There was a company that Disney sued that was licensing out characters, and they had the Winter Queen with a sort of a light blue colored dress and a blonde wig that didn't look quite like Elsa, but definitely was supposed to be like Elsa. There was the Arabian Prince character who I thought that one was just called Aladdin because the name Aladdin is public domain. You can just call it whatever you want. So I mean, so these things do happen, and those were arguably attempts to make characters who are from those universes but aren't the exact character. But I think that was one of those wink and a nod things where Disney was like, no, that's too close.
It's really the character.
And,
we all
it's really the
know
character.
It. Yeah. But again, if I come in and I say, hey, I'm going to be somebody who's just simply a courtier of, Jasmine in Aladdin.
Yeah, like a character that doesn't exist at all. Like, okay, or I'm just going to be one of Ariel's unseen cousins off scene.
Yeah. Or frankly, an unseen servant, stuff like that. I mean, most of the garb, you see there is, I would argue, at least traditional fantasy Middle Eastern. I'm not sure it really is Middle Eastern, but I think you'd say it's fantasy Middle Eastern.
It's a Western's audience idea of what Middle Eastern.
It's sort of fantasy Middle Eastern. Where do you sort of bump into, again, what's the line, what's the things behind it when you start getting into what's a character that's kind of not there? I am somebody who isn't there. A sort of great example, I think, in conjunction with this to sort of get into it is let's take something like the show Wicked, which is getting at the backside of Wizard of Oz. Mm-hmm. Well, part of Wicked is we have a bunch of talking animals because that's a sort of, component of Wizards of Oz, not necessarily. Well, there's not any animals really shown in Wizard of Oz that are the talking animals. I mean, you have a little bit sort of associated with it. You have the monkeys. But, what about a goat, which is, does appear in Wicked? We have a goat, appear. That character doesn't really show up. So what makes that a Wicked or a Wizard of Oz character? If somebody had just said, hey, I'm going to play a talking goat, things like that. What if I'm going to play Pan? Say I'm going to jump into this, I'm going to play Pan. Well, Pan's in Shakespeare. Like, he's an existing character, from he belongs in Greek mythology.
Arguably also in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
The Fawn at the beginning.
Exactly. And there's, I can find Pan in a huge number of fantasy things.
Mr. Tumnus, that was his name. Yeah. Mr. Tumnus.
That, that arguably half goat, if you want to sort of refer to it, as whatever it would be. But I think most people refer to it as Pan. But what if I put that in Harry Potter? Well, there is one in Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And so, you bump into these things where it sort of says, when does it become something specific from the show? And specifically when it's, I am playing something which specifically isn't in the show.
Yeah, like you're making an effort to not be something in the show that's still clearly from whatever the show, like Star Trek's an easy one. We were talking about, what if I want to go as a generic Imperial Vice Admiral? I'm going to have the white suit with the little, the insignia is very generic,
Star
right?
Wars, actually.
Or Star Wars, what did I say?
He said Star Trek. But
all right, okay, well, fine.
I'd be a red shirt in Star Trek.
Yeah, red shirt, there you go. You can do the same thing in Star Trek, although the Vice Admiral thing in Star Wars is a lot more distinct. We get the white suit and the Imperial insignia, which is just like a bunch of squares. It's not particularly distinct.
And I believe it's even based on something else that they had previously. I remember that if I heard something at one point in time that's based on something, that's how they did the ranking. I may be wrong about that. But.
Yeah. Maybe there's an argument maybe that the simpler the costuming design is, is it the easier it is to infringe or the harder it is to infringe?
Well, what you really bump into is it's something where it then says, hey, if I show up in a black jumpsuit, which is sort of arguably the basics of, what is an Imperial officer's uniform, all I do is put red and blue squares, in some kind of pattern. Well, what if I even make them, let's say, red and green? So I'm going to come up with my own rank, whatever it is. I'm a science officer or something along those lines. What makes it same as the idea is if I show up as, I'm just wearing a blue jumpsuit that happens to have a triangle in the corner of it. How much is that really Star Trek? When you bump into this as well, we were talking a little bit about Disney characters, it kind of gets at that thing where, because you're not allowed to dress up as Disney characters above a certain age when you go to Disney World or Disneyland. It's just not allowed that you show up in costume. Young kids are allowed, but you're not. People doing the I am a character without being one. Mm-hmm. So the idea of I'm wearing a yellow sundress arguably makes you Belle from Beauty and the Beast, even though that's a generic look.
Yeah,
like they
anybody
can't stop
can just
that,
wear one. Yeah.
And so, and people doing that, the idea of how can you skirt the law? Where can you be a character in a Disney thing instead where they're not going to say you're not cosplaying?
Well, that's a good example. I mean, I want to be my own, say, Disney princess, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean to be a Disney princess? It just means, right? Like
you probably need a fancy dress with oversized shoulders.
Yes, and some kind of animal companion.
and you have to leave your people. That's the requirements, right?
I'll bring my comfort duck with me or something. I mean. You see what I'm saying, though? Like, the princess thing's a good example. Unless you're dressing like one of the specific ones, isn't it just a pretty girl in a dress, right?
And that's the thing. Now, a lot of times those dresses are particularly bright colored, just the nature
tend
of the
to be
animation.
Ornate, yeah.
And they tend to be ornate, tend to be kind of fancy, and tend to be, I would argue with the sort of the multicolor courtesan type of style. Again, that's where I was picking on the elongated shoulders. That's a big thing. You see Snow White, Maleficent, a lot of the characters have kind of elongated shoulder pads. But what we're talking about is Renaissance England.
Right. But you also have like the Princess and the Frog. I forget the character's name. Tanya, I think?
Tiana.
Or Tiana? Yeah.
Tiana.
I mean, she worked in New Orleans. She wasn't wearing English courtier clothing.
But again, what does it mean to be a generic English Disney princess? And quite frankly, Disney's even pointed at this with the T-shirt that is the picture of Princess Leia with my favorite Disney princess. Yes. Which quite frankly is one of my favorite T-shirts Disney ever put out. I just thought that was such a great idea. But the thing that I think you really get into is it's again, what does it mean to be in this universe? If I come in and I say I am a generic Jedi, most people at a convention is going to recognize that. At the same time, if I was to simply walk around town wearing a cloak, most people might think I'm a little weird, but people do that. Like,
you see him from time to
time. You see him from time wearing clothes. A cloak is a very functional item of clothing, even in the modern world. I mean, there are companies that make modern versions of cloaks to people to wear because it's a functional item of clothing.
Let's talk about the trade dress issue. Copyright, might cover some of this. It's probably not the strongest argument, especially if the person doing the cosplay has done a really good job, and it really is all original and is just inspired by the ideas from the show as opposed to any particular design. But you still have trade dress. But it has some of the same problems, I would argue, because if you're asserting trade dress rights, well, let's talk about this. One,
what is trade dress?
What is it? And it is what we would broadly call the look and feel, right?
Yeah, it's always referred to as look and feel. So the idea is something looks and feels like. The example I always use is you can always tell when you're in a restaurant that used to be an IHOP or that used to be a Pizza Hut.
Like a Taco Bell or something.
Yeah.
Or McDonald's. The old McDonald's is very distinct.
Partially because their buildings have a distinct look. Pizza Hut's the best example where they used to have that kind of funky red roof. Now, they've gotten rid of those over the years. But if you see an old building like that, it used to be a Pizza Hut. And if you actually look at the Pizza Hut logo, it has that roof as part of the logo. And so,
it's the Hut part of the Pizza Hut.
It's the Hut part. Yeah, no, not with two T's, but the
Pizza the Hut.
Pizza the Hut. But yeah, you get into those are the things where it's just that's the example. The other one that I've always heard is sort of a great way to think about it is if I was to blindfold you and I was to take you somewhere in the world and deposit you in a McDonald's and take off the blindfold, you would know you were in a McDonald's, even though you'd have no idea what city you were in.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point is that the trade dress is that it's McDonald's without seeing the language of the menu board or anything else. You have no idea where you are.
Panera's like that. You go into any Panera, you're in Panera. Starbucks.
Yeah. Same kind of idea. You know what they are because they have that very distinct look. That's considered trade dress. And so it's that look and feel. But it can go beyond just building design or sort of structures like that.
Traditionally, it's advertising and packaging and the way the product is put together. You can also get trade dress in a product itself. It's a lot more difficult. But one of the difficult things about asserting trade dress is that you got to be able to explain what the trade dress is.
Yeah, you got to be able to say, hey, what is it? So it's the roof shape of a Pizza Hut. That's something I think you get, and it's red in particular as well. So we can look at it and say that's the distinctive element of it. When you get into something like a McDonald's, what makes it? Well, it's plastic seats. It's kind of the design of them. It's the kind of checkered pattern on the floor. You can all picture a Pizza Hut or a Burger King and sort of see, how do they look different?
Steak and Shake's got a very distinct look. Yeah.
You can kind of see what it is, but you can definitely point to aspects and say it's this, 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 and this. Now, how many of those you may need, how the combination has to work. I'm not sure a white and black checkered floor necessarily means Steak and Shake.
Well, it could be any 1950s era diner.
It's combined with other aspects of it, you would definitely sort of know, those are the kind of things you get into. Well, now we're getting into what's trade dress in Star Wars. And this kind of gets back to our very first episode. If you watch the Rogue One trailer, you can see it like when you first see the Rebel base. It's Star Wars because the helmets that the rebels are wearing, the general look of it, you kind of looks vaguely like Yavin 4, the sort of big massive blast doors that they have for the hangars, the sort of piles of equipment sitting around that tends to be cubicle, things like that. You got to look at all this. Well, but what if I just said it's a hangar door in a forest planet? That doesn't really necessarily imply Star Wars.
It could be anything, right? Yeah.
And so you kind of have to point in what, how many of those are there. And it's why that one's a great example because again, it's, we said in our first episode, if you watch that trailer and just take off what the movie is, you'll still probably know it's a Star Wars movie. That was also done well, for example, when they did the Austin Powers Spy Who Shagged Me sequel, where they did what really looked like it was going to be a Star Wars Episode 1 trailer and isn't because they play off the trade dress of the Emperor's Death Star throne room and then make it the sudden shock reveal that nope, it's Austin Powers sitting on the chair. If you haven't seen that trailer, by the way, it is worth watching. It was a great sort of cultural moment that it's kind of fallen out of popularity, but definitely people have understood and thought was great. But yeah, so that's when we really say that's the kind of idea behind trade dress. Well, okay, we can say what makes it necessarily look like the Emperor's throne room. Well, it's not necessarily the shape of the window. It's just a round window. It's not necessarily the shape of the
our windows
throne.
Here look like that.
Yeah. We've even joked about that repeatedly. But yeah, you can't necessarily say what it is, but you say at some point in time it crosses to trade dress. Well, if it's just a Jedi, it's one character. Is that really trade dress? Do we have trade dress in a single character?
Well, you wouldn't be able to register trade dress in Star Wars, right? You have to be unregistered because how would
trade dress is rarely registered. It's occasionally use design patents to cover parts of it, like it's a container or something.
Well, the problem is you have to submit a drawing to the trademark office on what the trade dress is, and if your trade dress is just it looks like Star Wars, what do you give them? I mean, I don't know what you'd submit.
Now you can't just do a trade dress even without a registration.
Yeah, you can.
Do.
It's very difficult.
But that's the idea where you're going to do a court and you're saying this is what the trade dress is, this is the look behind it. Now this also gets a little bit into our AI episode where we talked about the idea of AI saying, hey, make me a generic Jedi Knight, those kind of things. We're getting into that same kind of question again. You can start to see where, we joke about this podcast being the podcast that answers questions with no real answers.
Yeah.
This is where we're starting to get into the trouble here is we can kind of look at it and we can say there probably is a line here somewhere that you cross, but one, where's the line? And two, what is the line?
And that's the thing. I think to a large extent, nobody knows because with trade dress in particular, it's going to boil down to, one, can you establish that you have trade dress at all?
Yep.
Which is a pretty tough threshold to, you probably establish that you have some kind of trade dress. I think nobody would dispute, like, there is a look to Star Wars.
Yeah.
Does it rise to the level of a legally protectable interest in the look and feel of the universe? And I don't know that you could say that without running into the same problem in copyright where if you go so broad that you say anything that looks like Star Wars is mine,
Yep.
I think the broader you go, the more likely the court's going to say, well, no, you can't monopolize everything that looks like 1970s gritty sci-fi. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah. And then when you get to that point of saying, okay, yes, there is some trade dress, and here's what we think that line is, well, did you cross it with whatever it was you were doing?
Yeah.
That's the next
Which
question.
is ultimately up to a jury, right? Like, would a jury be confused? But even if not, we get back into dilution. Is what you're doing diluting the value of the trade dress?
And so I think the big thing behind this and where this is such an interesting issue to struggle with and why we tend to do podcasts on stuff like this and why it sort of fits for us, what we're doing here is we're saying there's 4 questions that need to be answered effectively in the affirmative for this to be an infringement. But all 4 questions are not clear answers either way.
Yeah.
And so when we get into the idea of saying, is it an infringement? Well, it's hard to know because there's so many questions, none of which has a clear answer. It's very hard to know exactly what the outcome is.
So if we were to look at Star Wars and say, no, you can't monopolize 1970s gritty sci-fi, okay, fine. Let's talk about Star Trek, because they've changed over time.
Yep.
We have sort of the corny, cheap sets from the original series, the now probably equally corny and cheap-looking sets from Next Generation, with still a different aesthetic, a little more refined and sort of that 1980s contoured, bubble-shaped, consoles and ships and stuff. Yep. But then you have Deep Space Nine, which is grittier, and the space station, the Defiant is a different kind of ship design. But then we get into the newer stuff. Star Trek Discovery is a complete reimagining of the entire aesthetic. You have the alternate timeline in the new movies that had Christopher Pine. Who's the director behind those?
This is giving me too, but
whoever, same person who wrote Episode 7. I'm blanking now. The Lost guy. Anyway, I'm sure if you're listening to this, you're yelling at your speaker. You idiots. Anyway, so that's a different look, different design. And then you have Brave New World, which I haven't seen yet, but I've seen some clips. That's sort of a blend, I think, between next gen and original series, kind of a retro. So there are all these different looks. Isn't that the opposite problem? You've chosen so many different looks. Can you claim that you monopolize all of them?
But there's also similarities across them with things like clean lines, a lot of curves.
The uniform designs have some continuity.
A lot of bold color, bold color denoting.
Well, science is blue, security's yellow, and
security's yellow. Security's red.
I thought officers were red.
No, security officers are yellow.
What's
security
yellow?
And engineering.
Is yellow enlisted?
No, yellow's command.
Oh, okay.
Yellow's command. Captain Kirk wore yellow.
But Captain Picard wears red.
Everybody wears red.
But Data didn't wear blue, and he was the science officer. He was the
medical wears
officer.
blue. Medical wears
my
blue.
Gosh. Trekkies, I'm sorry. We should know better.
I do know better, but I know it's yellow because I have a tie which was made out of the original.
I've seen that tie, yes.
Copied material from the original Star Trek, which is Command Yellow. That's the reason I have the one for what is. So I'm literally wearing, quite literally, Captain Kirk's uniform.
It's a hideous shade of yellow, too.
It's a hideous shade of yellow. It's mustard yellow. And it's a very thick, heavy fabric, which is also kind of problematic for a tie.
So we talked about this before. You have the Orville, which is a very Star Trek looking show, but it's like a comedic show. It's not like serious sci-fi. It's Seth MacFarlane, so of course it's silly and dumb and kind of juvenile. But that seems to be fine. But then the guys that made Axanar got in trouble. So where's the line here?
Well, then that's also talking about parody. We have Spaceballs, which is probably going to be licensed, but it's still one of those things where we've got all these kind of questions of lines. Again, what does it take to copy a look and feel of these?
The irony of Spaceballs, I was reading about this. They did ask George Lucas if they could do Spaceballs, and he was like, yeah, of course, go crazy. He only had one stipulation: no merchandise. And so instead, they crammed the merchandise joke all throughout the entire movie without ever making any of it.
But yeah, so I think what you really get into when you start talking about, again, the Star Trek universe, we can find common elements across it, but there are also common elements across a lot of other sci-fi. A lot of 70s sci-fi has very clean, curved lines. The idea of it being utopian. World on the Edge of Tomorrow. I mean, take a silent film from the 50s, has a lot of the same elements as, what it is. There's a lot of Star Trek, because it took to utopian ideals. A lot of those things are just broad utopian ideals that have been used in science fiction for a long time. That they appear in the Marvel universe. The idea of aspects of, there's aspects of the cities and the Avengers Tower and stuff like that, which arguably could fit in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Because of, again, that utopian universe type element. You also have the Borg, which have nothing to do with the rest of the Star Trek. It looks more Star Wars.
It does. It really does. Yeah.
And so you really have these kind of things where you say, what is the aesthetic again of Star Trek? But at the same time, I think if I showed up in a yellow jumpsuit, with a little, triangle, being worn across my, on my left breast pocket, people would say I'm in a Star Trek uniform.
Well, how about this? Like, some of the costumes and some of the alien designs in Star Trek were really, let's call it, budget conscious.
Yes, that's very true.
I'm thinking specifically here of the slime that kills Tasha Yar. So couldn't I go to a convention just wearing a couple of garbage bags, like some black Glad bags, and just say I'm the tar creature? Like, is that a problem?
Well, let's face it. I mean, it's how much can you just show up in somebody who's been spray painted a different color and wear a bikini for Star Trek?
Yes, exactly.
It's especially the original Star Trek. There is a lot of budget constraints.
Well, like the Gorn.
The Gorn's actually one of the ones I was thinking about. At the same time, let's face it, Wolfman and the
that was
Star
a repurposed costume.
It literally is the Wolfman.
Yeah, they just went and saw what they had in inventory and had a guy put it on.
And so you get into these things where you have these repurposed costumes and kind of stuff across. Okay, how are we going to deal with the idea of what these things are? And that's really where this gets interesting.
Well, how about this? What if I want to protect my design?
Yep.
So I've got my own lightsaber design. I think it's cool, and I want to make it and sell it. So whether I use it, practically speaking, this is a lot of theory crafting. Is anybody really going to come after us just for cosplaying and like showing up at a con with it? Probably not.
I think it's one of these things where we're starting to see a little bit more of it, which quite frankly I find surprising because of exactly these issues where it's if you push too far, you have a decent chance of something coming back and biting you.
Especially if there's pictures, right? Like if I just show up.
Yeah.
I mean, how likely is Disney going to waste their time with that? That's not a good use of their resources. But if I'm going to these other non-Star Trek, or putting my own on for money that I'm charging for and keeping, and then everybody's showing up, even though I don't call it Star Wars and don't use any of their trademarks, if everybody knows it's a Star Trek, or like trivia nights, right? I've been to Star Wars themed trivia nights. I won one single-handedly.
Yep.
Is that a problem? Like, we did a trivia night episode, but it's kind of the same thing. Like, what am I really using? It's a fundraiser, so maybe nobody cares. But once you have pictures online and basically the more commerce you have involved with it, the more likely you are to attract somebody's attention. And then it kind of doesn't matter really whether you're technically right on the law. Do you want to fund an academic argument over the nuances of what they talk about on Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, or do you just want to stop?
Yeah, and this is where you get into the weird ones. I think one of the things you really bump into in cosplay is when people who are good at cosplaying and are good at this sort of technology of cosplaying start producing costumes for others and selling them.
Which inevitably happens, right? People are like, dude, you're so good at that. You should sell this.
Yeah, make your helmets. And so people release, hey, here's the 3D plans of how to make the helmet. You can print it yourself, and suddenly it starts looking that way. You're making helmet replicas. We don't want you making helmet replicas of, the Mandalorian's helmet because we sell those as collectible items.
We did see this to some degree in the Chapter House case involving a Warhammer.
Yeah, and actually it's something that has been recently talked about a little bit in some of the Warhammer boards of, games are potentially cracking down on some of these cosplaying companies and how that's connected potentially to them releasing their own cosplaying components as officially licensed. They are actually releasing some of those now. Well, you kind of look into it and say, well, where's that line as to what you want me to do? Is it a problem to produce a helmet? What does it mean for something to be, to really pick on sort of, an auto gun, which effectively an auto gun is an AK-47. It's almost exactly the same aesthetic. It's a slightly modernized sort of look of it. Well, can I copy some aspect of it, and I make it grossly out of proportion, which is kind of one of those things that's kind of
that's very Warhammer thing.
Warhammer is for the guns to be grossly out of proportion. But part of the reason for that was called molding problems in the 60s and 70s, and 80s as to what it is. They had to make things grossly out of proportion because of just molding requirements. But now that's kind of a thing. But yeah, so it's this very, very interesting around these kind of questions where you start saying, where are these lines? Where can you do this? Where can't you do this? Again, where it comes into a production versus a non-production sort of thing, where does it cross over? If I say, hey, I'm going to make a costume for a friend for money, versus I'm selling costume bits. I mean, let's face it, I can go out and I can buy, Halloween's coming. You can walk down, you can buy licensed costumes, many of which do not look very much like what they're supposed to be.
That's the motivation for a lot of this stuff is people want really believable, high quality cosplay, and your average, costume store, Halloween costume store kid is honest. Mostly if it's cheap garbage, Yeah. I mean, it's not cheap, it's expensive, but it's still garbage.
Yeah. Well, it's designed to be worn once.
Yeah, exactly. It's by design. It's not like they're not capable, but that's not what the market is. The market for the high quality stuff is a lot smaller, but it still exists. Yeah. And so I'm tempted to say, okay, well, the market exists, the demand is there, then IP holder just issue the licenses, but it's their IP. They don't have to.
Yeah. And again, this is where we're getting now. And I think what we're really getting into is it's not just that there's a whole bunch of questions that have to be answered to determine whether or not it is infringement. There's a whole bunch of questions that have to be answered as to what we're talking about at all. Is there even anything here? And to the extent there is something here, what is it?
Well, and sort of the thinner the assertion of rights, the broader the fair use, especially on the copyright side. There's not really a fair use defense on the trademark side. It kind of is.
There is, but there's
more specific.
It's more related to accurate portrayal than anything else as to what it is, and that's not really relevant for something where you're not saying. I'm not saying that a McDonald's hamburger and a Burger King hamburger are these different sizes, which is an accurate portrayal. Yeah, that kind of thing sort of with it.
Yeah, but you have the fair use on the copyright side, which will excuse a lot. And although this is not the way the law is officially written, it's often how it works out in practice. The less literal and less comprehensive your copying is, the more likely you are to, one, not infringe at all, and if you do, for it to be a fair use.
Yeah, and that's, I think, I think where you also get really interesting with this is it tends to imply heavily prosthetic, heavily costumed characters are more protectable than generally human characters. But obviously, when you're making a movie or something like that, you need generally human characters to be relatable and to allow actors to show more.
But we saw this play out in the Midjourney case. All of the copyrights that they gave examples of in the petition were almost all costumed characters or CGI characters that were heavily made up with the underlying actor mostly not being perceptible, which sidesteps the question of, well, is the actor a necessary party to the litigation? Obviously, you don't want to complicate this by having to join Mark Hamill to the lawsuit. Mark probably doesn't want to be involved.
And this is also where it gets sort of more complicated when you start saying, well, what about something which is really pretty straightforward? And an example I use, how many Ford Explorers are painted up to look like the ones in Jurassic Park? Mm-hmm. All it is a paint job. The Ford Explorer is a Ford Explorer. It's a Ford Explorer in the movie. Like,
what about Transformers? If I just slap a Decepticon logo on something, or Autobot's probably a better example. So slap an Autobot logo on my yellow VW Bug.
Yeah, or my yellow Camaro
with infringing the Bumblebee patent now?
Yeah, and those are the things you really kind of bump into. Is it's this, the more things are for real world, you kind of bump into those questions. And again, if you drive to conventions, you see those. I mean, the Ecto-1 is a converted, ambulance.
Was it an ambulance or a hearse?
I don't remember. Maybe it's a hearse.
It was a hearse.
But I know you can get that particular vehicle.
Which is way funnier and more appropriate for Ghostbusters.
You can get that particular vehicle. You can get Lightning McQueen. He's based on a real car, those kinds of, where do you get into these things where you need them to be something recognizable in the world? And again, or you want it to be a human actor. You want something where an actor's face is visible. Well, if I'm going to say the Jedi is a human in a robe or a person in a robe, which can be human, if it's just me, I'm not looking like any actor. It's just me.
Yep.
So why can't I wear the robe?
One thing I want to cover while we're on this subject is on the question of protection versus infringement. We see this happen a lot on our professional side of our jobs, where people think if they've got their own IP, it means that you don't infringe anybody else's. Like, I got a patent on my product, therefore, how can anybody claim that my product infringes their patent or copyrights the same way? But that's not how it works. Let's say, I may be able to get a design patent or a copyright registration on my own original lightsaber design, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't also infringe somebody else's.
On the patent side, I always say it's a little bit clearer because the easiest thing on the patent side is you infringe a patent if everything you have is in the patent. You can get a patent if not everything you have is known. So there's an important thing because one says everything you have is known, the other one specifically in the patent. The other one says it says everything is not known. So there's a very clear sort of dichotomy, which makes clear the issue with it. You get the patent if there is something new, not everything was known. You infringe the patent if everything is in the patent, everything was known. And so you can have a scenario where everything is known and something else new is added.
I'm thinking design patent specifically, though, with like a lightsaber
but
design.
That's still true, I think, when you get
it's the same analysis.
Yep, you get the same kind of analysis. And so it really is, they're totally separate. Now, there's a little bit in trademark where there's a little bit more overlap of, hey, having your own trademark can protect you against other trademarks because there's a sort of recognition they have to be different.
Yeah, like the analysis specifically is, are these going to be confused?
Confusingly similar, yeah.
So if even if yours does incorporate similar elements, you may still be fine. And the fact that you get a registration is not dispositive of the question, but it's definitely a good check mark in your favor.
Copyright's more like where you have the kind of patent problem in some respects, because in copyright it's, I didn't copy it, but it's a derivative work. A derivative work necessarily means you didn't copy it, you derived something from it. So you kind of bump into that. What does it mean to derive from it and things like that? So it is an important distinction to point out the fact that just because you have your own IP does not mean you are protected from being asserted of infringing somebody else's IP.
And likewise, just because you're not infringing doesn't mean what you've got is protectable. Sometimes things aren't.
So there's some interesting sort of, components around that as well, practical pieces as you're thinking about this. I think the real thing and sort of maybe a takeaway from this episode is we're looking at it.
This is a classic LGG episode of we're asking all these questions and nobody really knows because either it's too fact sensitive and we'll find out when the jury tells us, or the law just doesn't really know how to deal with it completely.
Yeah. And a lot of times the law has also not been tested because it's too fact sensitive. Yeah. And so
there's not enough at stake, with like the cosplay.
Yeah. And again, you're talking about something that's a very complicated, would have to be raised issue. And a lot of these cases just get resolved by default. It's them telling you to say, no, please don't do this. And the person saying, fine, I won't. Yeah. It's not that you can't. It's just that you have respect for the brand. You're like, nope, I'm not going to because they asked me not to. It's when you get into the idea of somebody saying, well, I have commercial stuff around this and I'd actually prefer to pursue that. And I made a living or a business around this that I want to continue. But that's also where the law gets a little bit clearer when you start getting into commercial stuff. Because it becomes, okay, what is, dilution gets clearer when we say it's a business versus a business.
We should probably highlight that too as a good takeaway from this. A lot of things that you can often get away with when you're not doing something commercially, when it's just you as an individual making a costume for yourself, going to a con, or even posting pictures on social media. It's not a commercial use. There's no money involved. And so although maybe it technically could be actionable in a legal sense, it's just not worth doing. Like I said before, there's nothing at stake. But people sometimes make the mistake of inferring from that sort of default state of play that that's how it works commercially too. Yeah. And we see that happen from time to time as well. That is not true. Yeah. The calculus changes radically.
The easiest thing to keep in mind behind it is that one of the first considerations we talked previously about in fair use, the four considerations in fair use. The primary one is the use commercial.
Yeah.
And so that's where you bump into and say, well, if it's not commercial, that cuts one way in fair use. As soon as you say it is commercial, it cuts strongly the other way.
But people misunderstand commercial as meaning I'm not making money. It can still be commercial without money changing hands.
But it usually means if somebody changes hands, even if you don't make anything from it.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be money, but you can be commercial without it. You also bump into where do you have the idea of something being original in a universe without it? And the perfect example I use, I don't know if this guy still got his stuff posted on the internet, but I saw this years ago. And I always thought this was one of the coolest con costumes that somebody went. The guy went, and what he had was the idea, he wanted to wear a costume that he felt would actually sort of embolden him in a costume of being slightly daring. So what he did is he reimagined what would Jabba do with a male slave?
Okay, yeah, I've seen this before.
And what I love about the concept behind the costume is he said it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah.
You need to accentuate different parts. This is supposed to be a dancer. That's the idea. This was a person that was a dancer. But the material should look similar. The general styling should look similar because we see two different female slaves wearing very similar outfits. Mm-hmm. And he completely reimagined the costume and then wore it to a convention. What's cool about it is the fact that it has virtually nothing to do with the costume. That
I'd
we see
imagine
in
more
the
of a gladiatorial, like, right? The reason
Yeah.
to display, for Java to display a slave is to show off a prize, right?
Well, one of the big things he did with it is he does do a little bit gladiatorial. He's bare torsoed, but is sort of he has like a loincloth type of look. He also wears very broad shoulder pads.
Interesting.
As part of the idea of saying, to sort of, again, emphasize the gladiatorial, but also emphasize the idea, if you're a dancer, as a male dancer, what are you doing? Well, a lot of times you're moving your shoulders. Your shoulders are accentuated, sort of stuff like that. And what was cool about it is that he goes through, and you can probably find his stuff on the internet, where he goes through how he thought about this kind of stuff, behind it. And it's a very interesting concept of what does it mean behind it. That's very in universe, but at the same time, that nowhere appears anywhere.
That's probably way more thought put into this than if only this level of detail went into all these new Star Wars series.
And again, about the only thing you can say is it's gold and it's a little bit of the swirly sort of pattern to it. Other than that, it really has no concept, nothing related to it whatsoever.
Yeah, like if you didn't know what he was trying to do, it might just look like a gladiator's uniform or something like that. Yeah,
and so I use that as a sort of example behind it, where you can look at it and say, what does it mean to reimagine something in the universe? That's about as reimagined as I think you can get. And
I'd put that in like the safest category, right?
Yeah.
Like I'd never say anything is completely safe, but you've minimized risk with something like that.
Yeah. And, it then comes into why, and that's what we were trying to get at with this entire episode is sort of, why do we say this? Why do we say that's still inside the universe? It's so different. Why do we still say it's inside the universe? And part of it is because they say it is.
Yeah, it's more because the guy admits it, right? It's more homage, inspired by, but otherwise it's sort of taking something you saw, like a setting or a situation, and then expanding on it in a completely new, original direction that doesn't really use anything other than the ideas behind the original. Again, minimize risk.
Exactly.
All right. I think we got that one covered.
Yep, I think we did that. Now, again, this is the episode of things we revisited. We're probably going to revisit this again at some point in time because it's just an interesting question. But go back and watch some of our, if you're interested, go back and listen to some of our prior episodes. We've talked about this before a little bit.
We're going to probably do more of these. There's quite a few episodes we did in season 1 when we were trying to keep the format to 15 to 20 minutes, failing, but trying to keep the format to 15 to 20 minutes. We've since expanded, and so there's some topics we covered and they got very brief coverage, and we could probably go back and expand on those. So you may see some more of these coming. So go back and re-listen to season 1. Make sure you're current.
We're also trying to get people to download the back catalog. We'll see if you do.
Yes, we'll know. I can see the numbers. Okay, that's all for this time. We'll see you next time. Lauren, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.